Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be looking into, a pretty creepy crawly situation, actually.
Yeah, creepy crawly is right.
We're going to be joining these two student researchers, Kesser and Steen, and they're on this quest to understand this oak processionary moth infestation
Yeah.
in Odense, Denmark. And they've actually nicknamed these critters larvae from hell.
Yeah, larvae from hell. That's pretty evocative, isn't it? But what I think is so fascinating about this whole thing, though, is that Kesser and Steen, they're not just like laser focused on this like immediate problem of, these caterpillars right here, right now. It's that they're connecting these toxic caterpillars to the bigger picture, to urban planning and, like how our cities can actually better defend themselves against these kinds of invasive species. It's like a tiny little ecological thriller is unfolding right in the heart of Denmark.
Yeah, definitely. The larvae from hell paints a pretty vivid picture. But what makes these caterpillars so awful? I mean, are we talking just a minor inconvenience here? Or is it something more like a public health hazard?
Oh no, think public health hazard. But like with a lingering threat. You see these larvae are covered in these microscopic hairs, and they can cause these really severe skin reactions and breathing problems for both people and animals.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and the worst part is that these hairs can actually stick around in the environment for years.
Really?
Yeah, so they pose a risk long after the caterpillars themselves are gone.
So it's like a microscopic time bomb.
Kind of, yeah. It's not a great situation.
That's wild. So it's no wonder Kesser and Steen are so concerned about this. What are they doing to try to tackle this problem?
Well, they've actually traveled to Odense, the epicenter of this infestation, to really kind of learn firsthand about the challenges and the potential solutions.
Wow.
Yeah, they even met up with this Professor Raven, who is like this leading expert from the University of Copenhagen, to get his insights.
So they're really getting their hands dirty with this research.
Yeah, they're in the thick of it.
That's great. But with something this widespread, where do you even begin to find a solution? Are we talking just massive pesticide spraying?
Well, that's actually a point of contention, even for the experts. Kesser and Steen started out pretty skeptical about using pesticides.
Yeah.
But they're grappling with this potential need for maybe a more targeted approach, using this bacterium called Bacillus thuringiensis, or bleat for short.
But that rings a bell. Isn't
Yeah.
that considered like a more environmentally friendly alternative to those broad-spectrum pesticides that just wipe out everything?
You're exactly right. Bleat produces toxins that are specifically harmful to caterpillars, and it's seen as a way to kind of knock back this oak processionary moth population without causing too much collateral damage to other insects or, the wider ecosystem.
Okay.
But as with any intervention, there are always trade-offs to consider.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
No easy answers here.
Yeah.
It sounds like Kesser and Steen are facing a real ethical dilemma. But spraying anything it just feels reactive. Is there anything we could do from like a city planning perspective to try to prevent these infestations in the first place?
Absolutely. And this is where Kesser and Steen's observations about urban planning get really, really interesting. Like a lot of cities, actually. Odense has been planting a ton of trees to make the city greener, more livable, all that good stuff. But in their efforts to create these urban forests, they might have unintentionally rolled out the welcome mat for the oak processionary moth.
How so? I always thought planting more trees was a good thing for biodiversity, for a healthy ecosystem.
It is generally, but the problem with Odense and with a lot of cities is they've kind of fallen into this trap of monoculture planting. So that means they've planted huge areas with just like one or two tree species. In this case, a lot of oak trees. And well, guess what loves oak trees?
The larvae from hell.
Exactly. It's like setting up an all-you-can-eat buffet for these caterpillars.
Wow. So are we saying that cities should just stop planting trees altogether? Because that seems counterproductive to, creating healthier urban environments.
No, not at all. Trees are vital for our cities. The key is to move away from these monoculture plantings and embrace biodiversity. If you have a wider variety of trees, it's much harder for any one pest, like the oak processionary moth, to really, establish a dominant presence.
So diversifying our urban forest is a key takeaway here.
Yeah.
Are there any other city planning strategies that Kesser and Steen observed that could help in this fight against these invasive species?
Yeah, another crucial strategy, and this might sound kind of counterintuitive, is preserving old trees. I know they might not be as pretty as, freshly planted saplings, but those gnarled old trees, they offer a rich habitat for all sorts of creatures, including the oak processionary moth's natural enemies.
So the more diverse and mature the urban forest is, the better chance we have at keeping these pests in check naturally.
That's the idea.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Anything else cities should be mindful of?
Here's one that might seem obvious, but it's incredibly important. Careful inspection of imported trees. There's this theory that the oak processionary moth might have actually hitched a ride to Odense on trees imported from Germany.
Really?
Yeah, and these trees were meant for landscaping along the city's new light rail system, Letbanen.
Wow. So a light rail line unintentionally bringing in an invasive species that really shows you how interconnected everything is and just the unintended consequences of our actions.
Right.
So what's Odense doing to combat this infestation?
They're taking a multifaceted approach. They're trying to minimize pesticide use, obviously promote biodiversity, and they're even experimenting with physically removing the oak processionary moth nests.
It sounds like they're pulling out all the stops.
Yeah.
It's fascinating how this tiny creature has sparked such a big conversation about how we design and manage our cities.
You hit the nail on the head. And at the heart of it all is Kesser and Steen's question, is humanity itself to blame for these problems?
That's a big question, and one that's worth exploring further. We'll dig deeper into Odense's strategies, the Letbanen theory, and Kesser and Steen's observations about the human factor in all of this in the next part of our deep dive.
It's going to be a fascinating journey, so make sure to join us again.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the oak processionary moth invasion.
Last time we left off with Kesser and Steen pondering the role of humans in this whole ecological drama.
It's a question that really makes you think about our responsibility in managing these kinds of situations.
Absolutely.
So let's get back to Odense. What specific steps are they taking to deal with this infestation? It sounded like they're trying everything but the kitchen sink.
Well, they're taking a very multi-pronged approach, recognizing that there's no single magic bullet for a problem this complex.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So what's their strategy?
First and foremost, they're really trying to minimize pesticide use. That means avoiding those broad-spectrum pesticides that can harm beneficial insects and really disrupt, the delicate balance of the ecosystem.
Right, that aligns with what we talked about earlier, protecting those natural predators that could help keep the oak processionary moth in check.
Exactly.
So if they're limiting pesticides, what's their main line of attack?
They're focusing on two key areas. The first is actively promoting biodiversity, so planting a wider variety of tree species to create a more resilient urban forest. It's about moving away from those monoculture plantings that we discussed earlier.
Right, so it's like diversifying your investment portfolio, spreading the risk, and making the ecosystem less vulnerable to one particular threat.
Exactly. And the second part of their strategy involves some good old-fashioned manual labor. They have these specialized teams that go out and physically remove the oak processionary moth nests.
Wow, I can imagine that's an easy task.
Yeah.
This nest can be pretty high up in the trees, right?
It's definitely a challenging and potentially hazardous job. These teams have to wear, full protective gear to avoid contact with those toxic hairs we talked about. But it's a necessary step to protect public health, especially in areas with, high pedestrian traffic or near schools and playgrounds.
So they're minimizing pesticides, promoting biodiversity, and physically removing the nests. Anything else?
They're also focusing on public education, which is often overlooked but incredibly important. They're making sure that citizens are aware of the risks posed by the oak processionary moth and what they can do to protect themselves.
I can see how that would be crucial. It's not just about what the authorities are doing, but also about empowering individuals to take precautions and report any sightings.
Absolutely. They've launched these campaigns to teach people about the caterpillars, the risks of contact, and, what to do if they encounter a nest. Knowledge is power, especially when it comes to managing these kinds of threats.
It sounds like they're really covering all the bases.
Yeah.
But let's go back to that theory about the Letbanen light rail system potentially playing a role in introducing the oak processionary moth to Odense.
It's a fascinating example of how interconnected our world is and how even seemingly unrelated actions can have these far-reaching consequences.
It's like a domino effect. One decision can set off a chain reaction that leads to unexpected outcomes.
Precisely. And while we can't say for sure that the Letbanen was the culprit, it does raise some important questions about the risks associated with, imported plant material.
It makes you wonder how often this happens. Invasive species hitching a ride on unsuspecting cargo.
It's more common than you might think. Globalization has made it so much easier for species to move around the world, and sometimes they end up in places where they don't belong with devastating consequences.
So what can be done to minimize those risks? Is it as simple as inspecting all imported trees more carefully?
That's certainly a crucial part of the solution. Stricter inspection protocols can go a long way in preventing, stowaways like the oak processionary moth.
Makes sense. But I imagine there are challenges as well. It must be difficult to thoroughly inspect every single tree that comes into a country.
You're right. It's a logistical challenge, and there's always the risk of human error. Even with the best protocols in place, things can slip through the cracks.
So it's an ongoing battle requiring constant vigilance and adaptation.
Exactly. And it highlights the need for international cooperation to share information and best practices for managing invasive species.
It sounds like this oak processionary moth infestation has really opened up a Pandora's box of issues, from urban planning to global trade and the interconnectedness of ecosystems.
It has. And it all comes back to that question posed by Kesser and Steen. Are we as humans ultimately responsible for creating the conditions that allow these problems to flourish?
It's a thought-provoking question. And while there are no easy answers, I think Kesser and Steen's research in Odense offers valuable insights into how we can navigate these complex challenges and strive to create a more balanced relationship with the natural world.
I agree. Their journey is a reminder that we need to think holistically. Consider the long-term consequences of our actions and seek solutions that work with nature, not against it.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners?
For me, it's about recognizing the importance of biodiversity, both in our urban forests and in the wider world. It's about understanding that our actions, even seemingly small ones, can have ripple effects throughout ecosystems.
And it's about embracing a more proactive approach to managing invasive species, combining prevention, early detection, and targeted interventions.
Exactly. It's not just about reacting to problems after they arise, but about creating the conditions that make it harder for invasive species to take hold in the first place.
Well said. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll delve deeper into the biology of the oak processionary moth, those infamous toxic hairs, and explore some of the more nuanced debates about the best ways to manage this invasive species.
It's a fascinating and ever-evolving field of research, so be sure to join us for the final chapter of our deep dive into the world of the oak processionary moth.
Welcome back to the final part of our deep dives into the world of the oak processionary moth.
We've covered a lot of ground, haven't we? From the infestation in Odense to the challenges of urban planning when you're dealing with these invasive species.
Yeah, and that idea of thinking holistically about how we relate to the natural world.
Yeah, exactly.
But we haven't really dug deep into the oak processionary moth itself. What makes it so unique, so different from other caterpillars?
That's a great question. Because, beyond the, creepy processions and that whole larva from hell nickname, there's this really fascinating and somewhat sinister story hidden within these creatures.
Okay, so let's unravel that story then.
Right.
What's the biological secret weapon that makes these caterpillars so problematic?
It all comes down to those tiny hairs we've mentioned throughout this deep dive. They're not just any ordinary hairs. They're actually called urticating hairs, and they're packed with a protein called thaumatropoin.
Thaumatropoin. That sounds like something straight out of a Greek myth.
It really does, doesn't it? But it's very real, and it's what makes these caterpillars a public health nightmare.
So how does this thaumatropoin work? Is it like a venom?
You can almost imagine each hair as like a tiny barbed harpoon. When it comes into contact with skin, it embeds itself and then releases the thaumatropoin, which then triggers this massive allergic reaction.
Okay, so that explains the severe skin irritation, the rashes, the respiratory problems.
Exactly. And here's the really unnerving part. These hairs can actually detach from the caterpillars and become airborne.
Oh, wow.
So you don't even have to directly touch them to be affected.
That's kind of terrifying. So you could be walking through a park, completely unaware, and suddenly find yourself in a cloud of these microscopic barbed harpoons.
It's a possibility, especially if there are oak processionary moth nests in the area. And as we mentioned before, these hairs can actually linger in the environment for years.
Oh, God.
So even old nests and shed skin can still pose a risk.
It's not just about avoiding the caterpillars themselves, but also being aware of their potential presence in the environment.
Exactly.
Okay, so what precautions can people take to protect themselves?
Well, avoidance is always the best strategy. If you know there are oak processionary moths in an area, just steer clear. If you have to be in the area, wear protective clothing, long sleeves, pants, gloves, a mask.
It sounds like you're gearing up for a biohazard zone.
It's not quite that extreme, but it's better to be safe than sorry, especially if you're sensitive to allergens.
And if you do come into contact with the hairs, what should you do?
Immediately wash the affected area with soap and water, as if you were scrubbing away poison ivy. If you start experiencing any severe symptoms like difficulty breathing, a widespread rash, seek medical attention right away.
Solid advice. So we've talked about the biology of these caterpillars, the dangers they pose, but what about the bigger picture? Where do we go from here in terms of managing this invasive species?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And unfortunately, there's no easy answer. There's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Right, we've already discussed some of the approaches being used in Odense, like minimizing pesticide use, promoting biodiversity, physically removing nests, and educating the public.
Right. But there are other tools in the toolbox as well, such as using natural predators to try to control the population.
Okay, so like releasing armies of ladybugs to devour the caterpillars?
Not quite ladybugs, but there are a number of insects, birds, and even bats that feed on oak processionary moths. It's about creating the right conditions for these natural predators to thrive.
So it's another example of working with nature, not against it.
Precisely. And there are other techniques as well, like using pheromone traps to lure the moths, or even introducing sterile males to disrupt the breeding cycle.
So it sounds like there's a whole arsenal of weapons being deployed in this war against the oak processionary moth.
It's a constant battle that requires innovation, adaptation, and a deep understanding of the moth's behavior and life cycle.
And a battle that's being fought on multiple fronts, from the research labs to the streets of Odense and beyond.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for the future of our cities? Are we destined to live in fear of these toxic caterpillars?
I don't think so. But I do think it highlights the need for a much more proactive and holistic approach to urban planning. You know, we really need to think about how our actions are impacting the natural world and to design our cities in a way that actually supports biodiversity and resilience.
So it's about creating a balance, a harmonious coexistence with nature, rather than trying to dominate and control it.
Absolutely. And that's a message that resonates far beyond the oak processionary moth. It's a message for how we approach all our interactions with the environment.
Well said. And Kesser and Steen, with their intrepid journey to Odense, have given us a lot to ponder.
They have. Their research is a really good reminder that even these seemingly small creatures like caterpillars can have this big impact on our understanding of, that complex relationship between humans and the natural world.
It's a story of ecological intrigue, scientific discovery, and this ever-present challenge of finding balance in our interactions with the environment.
And it leaves us with this one final thought-provoking question posed by Kesser and Steen themselves. Is humanity itself to blame for the problems arising from our actions in nature?
It's a question we'll leave you to contemplate. As we conclude this deep dive, we encourage you to consider the role of urban planning in your own city and how it might help or hinder the fight against invasive species.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of the oak processionary moth.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking questions.